I'm so glad we're here. We can explain everything, you know? I'm just curious. I'm always curious to ask this, but especially for this movie. If this was your first time seeing Tropical Malady, can you. Yeah, oh, that's most of the. Um, I saw this movie, I think, 13 years ago on crappy DVD, and so I feel like this is my first time seeing it. Andrew, you know, tell me about your first encounter with this and with Chapang's work. Yeah.
So the very first film I saw of his was um, Mysterious Object at Noon, and I it's such a kind of like formal, playful movie that I didn't even really know like how to read it, and just was like, this is interesting. And a film school professor of mine was like, oh, like I think you should check out Tropical Malady. I think you'd be really into it. And so I watched it like on my laptop in probably like 2009. Um, and it was like such an experience. Like I knew nothing about the movie, and I like during that split, like I was like when it that like card comes up, I was like, oh wow, the movie's over. Like I was like, oh, like, and then it launches into this second section, and I just was like, what the fuck is this movie? And then just for me as like a gay Asian American man, like to see kind of desire and kind of represented in this way, and you know, like I will never forget the hand scene. Like the licking and the smelling and the sucking, like that is just like it's always going to be seared into my brain. Um, and it's just kind of lingered with me like since then. And so when Brendan asked me to guest curate the screening, like this felt like such a great opportunity to see it big, to see it on film. Um, you know, it's I feel like Apichatpong's career has really gained this kind of momentum that like people are just like, oh well, what's the next one, right? So like it just keeps moving forward, and so to look back for a moment is nice.
And it's funny, I think that we all laughed a little bit when he said, "Oh, you remember when my uncle who can recall his past lives,"
Yeah,
which, in
totally.
is a boon me reference in retrospect. It's funny that his career has had this momentum, as you say. When this film first premiered in 2004 at the Cannes Film Festival, I remember reading about it, and it it got a very mixed to hostile reception, as a lot of movies that are, operating in an, I almost don't want to use the word experimental, but on the margins of narrative cinema and just straddling so many different forms. And it won the jury prize there, from the jury headed by none other than Quentin Tarantino, who vigorously defended the film, kind of in the face of people who were asking, why did you give an award to something so difficult? I think it's funny now because it's been so heartening for me to see, as with subsequent films since, like Syndromes in a Century and Uncle Boonmi and Cemetery of Splendor. It's like, okay, we get him. We don't get everything, but it's like, yeah, we get this guy. It's like, and he has, it's not a brand. Maybe it's, as my friend was just saying just now. It's like the Apichatpong cinematic universe. Where there's this,
A lot of the
yeah,
same
a
actors.
lot of the same, and recurring, just the sort of themes and motifs. But I'm curious. Yeah, it's you know that first encounter with this movie. You can be sort of put off maybe by the difficulty of it, or you can, and I think a lot of people maybe are, but then you can also just submit to it, which kind of echoes, I think, the theme of the movie, which is very much, I think, as you were saying, about desire and about sometimes the violence of desire. And it's like, am I going to master this, or am I going to let it master me? And so, yeah.
Yeah, it's so funny. Like I was reading a little bit about that you know premiere and how people reacted to it, and like a lot of people thinking that like it's the filmmaker being like willfully difficult, and it's so not the case. Actually, it's like every choice made in here just feels, I think what I love about watching the film, is that it's both so kind of cerebral, but then also so intensely emotional, and so to watch in that way, I think it is really rare, and it's so like fascinating for me. Like this is like also like very silly, but like and kind of reductive, but like when Brendan asked me, like to curate, I just was like, well, what's gay and Asian, right? Like, which is like super silly of me, but it like led me to a list. Um, and, it's so fascinating just because I like to stay very plugged into kind of an Asian American like cinema culture and, within this like independent film scene. Um, and there's so much conversation about kind of like Asian American like male, like about masculinity, and I'm like a little bit sick of this question of like, can Asian men be hot, right? And what I love about this film is that it's talking about these things. It's it has a gay story, and it's these Asian people, these characters, um, but because it's made in Thailand by a Thai filmmaker with Thai people, like um, it's it's uncomplicated by like this kind of whiteness about like this American racial politics, right? And so it can be so elemental, and I'm so jealous of that in a way as a filmmaker. Like I think that's so like it's just about bodies and the land and like shitting and eating and gold and silver and caves. Like it's just like it's so spiritual, in a way that like I'm just like, oh, as an Asian American filmmaker, is that something that I'll ever be able to do?
There's a directness and kind of an immediacy about it, and it's almost like when it's like, say, when you're making Spa Night, you feel like you have to work harder just to get to this point where it's like, and where already it feels as if the audience is coming to it as this sort of other experience. I mean, it is worth noting, Api Chapong, to my understanding, is he is a figure who is you know especially at the early part of his career, was not fully understood or or embraced and his work is so different from what is typical of Thai cinema, and but he's also sort of he's very much a hybrid artist too. He synthesizes you know elements of Thai commercial and genre cinema, and yet he's also he's studied filmmaking at the Art Institute of Chicago, so he his work sort of very much straddles like the art house and an art gallery sensibility. So what I love about it, everything you said, but also he does hybridize all of these elements, and yet there's something very inviting about the movie, and for me it's and this is why the D word difficult, or the I word impenetrable, and a lot of these words that are sort of often ascribed to especially a lot of Asian cinema artists, not only but particularly. I just, it doesn't really that those words don't stick for me, and I think that there is this sense, when I'm watching this movie, especially this was my second viewing, this idea that like magic is everywhere and that it's available and it's very accessible actually if you just look at it, and even though the second half of this movie takes on this literally magical quality, but there's magic throughout the first half of it too. I mean, what is your take on the bifurcated structure of the film and the two halves? I mean, are they two halves of the same story? Is the second one like a dreamlike emanation from the first? I mean, I still have no idea.
Yeah, I mean,
But
what I like is that it does. I like that you say that it feels inviting, because I agree. There's this kind of allure to the storytelling, um and there's, for me, it feels a little bit just like a uh, like a simplification almost. It's almost like, let's take what's here at the, like, in this first part of the story, and get rid of everything except for like what really matters, right? And so in that way, that, it just feels like a clarification almost, at least for me. But um, there's also just like, I don't know. There just seems to be a weird logic that like just makes sense. Like the inner logic of the film is actually so beautiful. Even just this kind of silly thing where it's like, you know, after hand licking, the guy goes into darkness.
yes,
And just that, like, okay, like he becomes this tiger in the second half. I remember like the first time watching it being like, the soldier drives off on the moped after, and I'm like, you forgot your friend, like you left him in the jungle, and I find that so weird, but it totally makes sense, because guess what? He's gonna come back as a tiger in the second half. But yeah, like, the other thing that you said, like this question of, there's a I kind of think that it also feels a little inviting because of its like immense humanity, like each character, and it's funny. It's just, there's something that, like, I think in American cinema, these characters or these moments might get emphasized in a way that are very digestible, but the elements of this kind of storytelling, and these characters are like in here, like, I love that, like, those two rich women, those two sisters, like offer pot, like, and like make them go to the mall. It's
yeah,
like, it's a weird adventure that, like, I could see those characters in an American movie, but they would be even more ridiculous in a way. Um, or even like I couldn't help but laugh, but when the mom
yes,
is washing the pants and she takes out the note, and I'm like, that feels like such an American thing, like in an American coming of age movie,
hmm
and it's so funny that it's in here, but
yeah,
it's, yeah, I don't know. There's something
yeah,
about it, like that. He's not trying to overemphasize anything,
yeah.
you know.
Well, and then even that scene in particular when she goes and shows him that, and you wonder, is this, if you're looking through maybe American eyes or something, is this going to be some kind of confrontation, or like, and they kind of make a joke out of it, laugh it off, and like, oh, this note is actually for you. It's
And
very
like
much not obvious.
and
Way,
the
yeah,
puppy plays like a big part in that scene, right? Like everybody's paying attention to the puppy. Yeah, it's totally, yeah.
I mean, you find too, it was, for me, there's t- this interplay of sort of serenity and violence throughout the movie as well. And I think it's interesting that it starts off with, the discovery
Oh,
of this
yeah.
body, which we never find out anything about, or what the killer is, whatever. It's like this procedural or mystery that never comes to pass. Or when he's riding at night and there's this song
The
playing, and then you see,
the
yeah,
the guy's beating up
beating
the
up.
guy,
So
yeah.
it's just, to me, there is this sort of irreducible complexity to the movie, whereby um, it's like moments of incredible humor and strange, kind of deranged looking sort of smiles coexist with, you know immense sadness. And even at the end, when he says, "This is our song, and this is a happy song," and he's crying, and it's an incredibly moving. It may not feel happy, but it's like he's looking back at it. It's this, yeah, it's emotional complexity.
I mean, that kind of duality. I mean, like that. When he's riding past, and you do see that like group beating up this guy, and like they kind of go after him. Even like the group, they like throw things, and like I think, again, like as a gay man, kind of watching this movie, reading the images in this movie, like it's hard to kind of um, not interpret like a certain kind of like just like fear of being hurt or killed because you're gay, right? That like from the very first scene is kind of under there. but yeah, like the song is so bizarre, and the emotions in that kind of last bit of that first act is like so, it's like there's so much smiling, um, and so yeah, it's a really, I mean, I think there's a certain kind of that complexity is what gives the film a certain kind of depth to it, and just a wrestling with, like I feel like this isn't like something that goes down smooth, but you kind of have to like roll it around in your mouth a bit, to like kind of figure out, well, what is that flavor, and that kind of, for me, is like a very engaging kind of viewing experience. But yeah.
I mean, I know you didn't, when I asked you earlier, you didn't want to make this about you, but, in Brendan's introduction, I completely agree with what he said about just the overpowering sensuality of the film, and to an almost like textural degree. And I do think we see this quality very much in Spa Night as well, which obviously is a very fewer talking baboons, but very much has that quality of the sense that and of desire is something forbidden, but also something very 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 seductive. What I don't know, is this, what do Abhijit films mean to you as an artist in your own right, and has there been something that you've taken away and concretely applied to your own movies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sense of humanity is like so important to me. I mean, like Spa Night is so kind of grounded in reality in a way that like Tropical Malady is kind of like flying by, like doesn't fucking care, right? But when you are in kind of a like a present space, in Tropical Malady, it is like there's just like a true sense of like these people feeling like they exist outside of the frame, that they live on, and like just that weird like karaoke duet, and the way that that's captured and not made a joke, a real kind of intense, like, um, feeling of these people, to me, is like not seen often in cinema, um, because I think people are so excited by and just always looking for like story. Like you're always kind of trying to find story. You're always trying to find the moral, and so for a film to kind of like so blatantly say like what necessarily is this moral, but like see these people, right, like witness behavior as opposed to psychology,
Exactly.
like for me it is something that I really wanted to do in Spa Night, was like it's not about what necessarily he's thinking, like you're never gonna know actually, but I will let you see what he's doing, and you can interpret from his actions like what he might be thinking, but I think it's a slight kind of reprioritization of certain things.
Yeah, to me, this viewing, especially, it played to me the first half in particular. It's, oh, this is just we're just watching life as it unfolds.
Right.
I want to open it up to the audience. I'm sure there are questions. Does anyone have any? Yes. I'll call you. Yes, right here. Sure. Oh, sorry. There's a microphone. Thank you.
I can definitely pull together the first and second half through the gaze of the desire and kind of the role play in a way. But I'm curious to know about the kind of other text or subtext of the soldier and kind of the military elements and the history of war in Thailand. And I'm just wondering like what I don't know, you didn't touch upon it earlier, so I'm curious if you know any of that background or know what he was like trying to gauge.
I'm not super sure either, but I have to say, like, the, and I didn't remember this at all, but the very last few moments of the film, where the voiceover is like, "Soldier, I miss you," and then it gets the sound gets fuzzy as if it's like coming through a walkie-talkie, and like that's insane. Like whatever choice that is, like that's insane. Like it's so and then like the shot goes in reverse and the sound is in reverse for a brief moment. Like, it's so fascinating that, like, you know, you're so much in this kind of nature space, and then you're suddenly made so aware of like artifice and technology. um I don't know too much about it. I don't know, Justin, do you know, like?
I can only say this movie. I mean, I feel like perhaps it's sort of, it's kind of a complication of the sort of the hypermasculine soldier. That is sort of being disassembled somewhat. I remember reading about Appy Chapong's, when the film came out, people asked him very much about, is this a political film? And he had said something to the effect of, a little bit evasive perhaps, saying yes and no. And he said something to the effect of, maybe it will be in a few years, but not necessarily right now. And the funny thing is that I actually think his movies have gotten more concretely political in recent years. Like Uncle Boonmi has, gosh, I remember it's been a while since I've seen it, but there are snapshots of, oh God, I don't want to mischaracterize it, but there's a military presence in that film. And that movie, which I remember it won the Palme d'Or shortly after a really violent week in Thailand. It was this surreal kind of mirroring of what was going on there. And then Cemetery Splendor is also sort of a soldier story. So I don't fully know as far as this film, but I know that he has become more politically engaged and has called out. He said, I think he said at one point at a festival that Thailand is run by the mafia or something. And so he was very, very critical of his country. So,
I mean, the little bit that I know of, like, I mean, Pichapong's intentions are like that, like this was like his personal film, it was kind of like the way that he talked about it, in a way that like Syndromes was like for his parents, but yeah, I mean, it would be curious to kind of like ask him that question now and see how he might talk about this politically.
Syndromes is a great companion piece to this as well. He made it just, I think, 2 years later, and it is also a bifurcated narrative, and so it is like this movie, and yet nothing like it at the same time. So, any other questions? Yes, up here.
Not to take the spotlight off this amazing movie, but I'm curious what else was on your short list for this evening.
That's such a sneaky question. For very different reasons, The Wedding Banquet by Ang Lee, because I have like an intensely personal connection to that film. When I was 8 years old, my mom wanted to rent it because she was like, this is a movie with Asian people that white people are watching, and so she was curious, and so we rented it, and then like she didn't know that it was a gay film, right? So I'm watching it with them, like this kind of nascent gay boy being like, whoa, like this is insane, and so that's just like another film that's stuck in my mind. But yeah, I mean, it's not a very long list, unfortunately, but I think what exists is like so interesting, and also like very sadly like not necessarily seen by a lot of, I have a lot of like queer Asian American friends who are just like, we are never on screen, and I'm like, oh, actually, like we do exist in places, they're just not necessarily marketed and distributed widely, so yeah.
Hi, I was curious about kind of like the folklore aspect of the movie, and I mean, if I was wondering if there was any background, like, is he tying in real folk tales, or he's just making shit up, or like, cause like, I'm curious about maybe the mythology, and is he creating his own mythology, and how that maybe influences his filmmaking? Yeah.
Once again, I mean, I do think he is drawing on, I believe it's I again, I don't want to mischaracterize, but I think he is drawing on actual folklore and actual stories and actual text. Obviously, very much transforming it in his own way. I wish I could speak more authoritatively on that, but there's part of me that just resists. I think it's a great question. Part of me resists demystifying the movie in some weird way. Not that it would. Maybe it would make it only more mysterious. But yeah.
Part of me would think it'd be so badass if he did, you know, like if he was just making shit up. But there's also, I mean, there's something about like, I think I say that jokingly because he already kind of is in a way just by putting it on screen. There's a kind of like an interpretation. There's a fucking with, you know, like, and some of it feels so. There's like kind of like puckishness to it all, you know, like the talking baboon, and you know, and even just that shot of like the tiger tail coming out of the woman's skirt, you know, like I think he's really letting himself and letting us be like, let's have fun with these things, you know. These texts are like malleable, they are, you know, subvertible, they are made fun of, you know. I don't feel like he has like it's not. I don't think he thinks of folklore as like a uninterpretable, like unchangeable text, right? And I think in that way, he, you know, it for me, like it really kind of reads as like a just like an expansion of it, right? Like it just becomes part of it in a way that I wish I could do.
So I thought it was really interesting. I mean, I guess the connection between the two parts where you had kind of the soldier is kind of a city boy or a city man, and then you have a country boy, and there's like a sense that the younger young man from the country, that he's more naive, maybe that he's not as experienced in the ways of gay experiences, you know, that maybe he's more reserved and whatnot, and yet time and time again, you know, he's the one that's like more wild and more aggressive, and he's the one that's fearless, not the soldier. Like when they're in the cave, it's the soldier that wants to turn back. You know, when he kisses his hand, the soldier kind of does it hesitantly, and like the young man kind of like it's like whoa, you know. In the theater too, like he's really like super aggressive, and so it's really kind of an inversion, because like often like there's a perception of like, oh, like in a kind of older younger gay relationship, like there's like an assumed dominance of like, you know, of one side, and here like there's kind of a switch on that, and then, you know, it's that like wild, I don't know, there's that like, I don't know, I think it's really interesting.
That I actually I do wonder if like the younger character is actually younger, because there he kind of looks that way, right? But there is like mention of him being in the military before, right? Because of this like photograph when he's like in, and so I wonder, it's like, oh, was he in military service before, you know, and now he's out of it? But like, and this is another thing that I wonder about the kind of film's potential like political, I wouldn't say statements, but like musings, is like he's kind of illiterate, right? Like he has trouble writing and reading, right? And that, to me, I wonder like what's going on there. But there is this kind of like a, you know, power dynamic, definitely, and that kind of feels. It's a little bit this question of just even how you watch this. It's like, you know, is this someone that is this a film that you try and dominate, or do you let it kind of come over you? There's this kind of push and pull constantly.
And, you know, in the first half, it almost feels like in the first half, I mean, the perspective of the movie, or the the amount of screen time is pretty equal, I think. And the second one, it is more we are walked through the soldier's eyes, and it is very much, and it is the younger, the country boy who becomes the tiger, and so in a way, I very much like your reading of that. There's also this weird sense, I can almost point to evidence. Like, I'm trying to think, this just kept occurring to me. It felt like sometimes they're switching places. I don't know, and maybe I'm just taking that from Apichatpong's, his sort of the transmigration of souls is which is this thing that conceptually I can't really completely get my mind around, but is very much a thing in his movies. But I don't know. It's
Well, just like who were like calling the younger guy like putting on the soldier's uniform at the shoe store. You know, like at first glance, I'm just like, oh, that's the soldier, and then you're like, oh wait, no, it's not. He's playing dress up. You know, yeah.
Or that pan where like I think it's the younger one looking in this direction, and then the camera moves this way, and then he's looking back, and then it moves back, and the soldier's there, and it's this, it's.
Oh right, yeah. It's like is it on the bed?
Well, that too.
Then
No,
on the bed,
that's another
yeah.
instance. But I was even thinking in the second half. But no, in the obviously where it's like where you're like, whose house is this even?
I was curious for Justin. You saw this at a time when I guess you had your eye on international film festival art house scene. And I'm kind of curious about this film in relationship to, I guess, the idea of slow cinema that was coming about at that time, and putting filmmakers from countries that weren't a major, weren't star attractions on the festival circuit on the map. And I know like there was a lot of discussion about this as a punishing form of cinema, an extreme form of cinema, but I never really I never really knew of it as a queer space as well, except in Apichatpong's films. I'm curious, when people were talking about this film at the time, were they, was the divisiveness about it focused mostly on this idea of it as a slow or challenging or was it like, was there a discussion of its like queer components as well?
Yeah, I that's a very good question. I can't, and I remember reading I wasn't at Cannes that year, and I started going later, and so I was just reading about it, and so I wasn't super engaged in the discourse around the movie on its first reception, and I don't know, I'd like to think that it wasn't because this is a queer love story that had something to do with why it was a polarizing or why it was widely hated. I do think it was. I think your question about slow cinema as a queer space is a really fascinating one, and I wish there was more evidence of that. This is not a slow movie to me. It's like it's funny, and I have a very mixed relationship with the term slow cinema, which I love and hate kind of equally. I think it's a convenient term to refer to this aesthetic that we whether it's Belle Étard or Hou Xiaoxian, and and I know Hou Xiaoxian's has had an influence on Apichatpong. But I think it's deceptive too, and I think maybe it is just something when we are first encountering the movie and we first see it, it just so frustrates our usual sense of rhythm that we interpret that as slow. This was my second time seeing the movie, and even though it was revelatory in a way that my first viewing was just as revelatory, I would say, I felt it's completely alive. I was completely alert to it, and he's not just planting the camera there for 20 minutes while a snake slithers by. It's like, it's not, it's really, it's like, I think that every cut is actually, the cutting of the movie, like there's a kineticism to it. So yeah, I think it's interesting though. I think that, certainly there are elements of slow cinema that, that govern his aesthetic, but I think it's misleading and really misguided to sort of just lump it. I think it's a very convenient put down of a lot of really interesting and diverse kinds of movies.
Yeah, it's like the only other thing I might kind of mention is kind of in thinking about this, even just the sound mix, like the level of the dialogue being down a bit, and like realizing that like again like there is this like preoccupation, like kind of overemphasization of like dialogue in American films, you know, and I kind of love that like all the dialogue in this movie is like just a touch quiet, and it just feels like part of the space. Like it's not like the conversations aren't or the scenes aren't about the words, but they're about how these words are spoken here, and that to me is like so insanely cool. And so you know, I think in that way, like it doesn't necessarily have this like Aaron Sorkin-y like pace that we're so used to in a way. But yeah, like again, like it's so interesting. It's kind of like if you stop trying to read it in a way that we're kind of super used to, it becomes engaging in a whole nother way, in like a really beautiful way.
I think that's all the time we have. But thank you so much for your great questions, and I hope you enjoyed the film. And thank you, Andrew. This has been a great
Thank you,
talk.
Justin.
Yes, thank you.